20, the ledger of our decisions. So I turned at last. So I betrayed my brother. Before daylight next morning, we assembled horseback at Lonnie Ford's ranch. I say we. The party included Mr. Ford, young County Sheriff Mike Lands, a federal investigator, Harper Juval, who'd driven in from Bismarck, and 3 ad hoc local deputies. The deputies were skittish, pleased at this chance to saddle up with scabbard Winchesters and go hunting fugitives in the snow. Mr. Juval looked them over without expression. 2 hours earlier, a rancher had found Dr. Anderson's Mercury parked empty on a county road, actually blocking the road, snow to its fenders. As the hilltops pinked, it was briefly argued whether I had any business going. "What are you, boy? About 9? This was Mr. Juval. 11, sir. He's the only one of us who's made the trip, Harper, said Lonnie Ford. At least he can tell us if we're going right. Of course, I'd never made the trip in daylight, so my usefulness was suspect in any case. Juval examined me with distaste. Mr. Land, he said to Dad, it's your call. You comfortable with your boy going? Dad wanted to go himself, but Juval had nixed that the night before. He's up to it, Dad said. I'm taking you at your word now. For Juval had promised that Davy would be taken quietly and without violence. Juval nodded. Dad looked at me. I saw he was counting on me to see them quickly to the cabin. He wanted it over with. Davy safe, Anderson alive. Perhaps he also believed that with Davy's little brother close by, the lawmen would be less apt to shoot. Let's go then, Juval said, while Lonnie Ford boosted me onto a shaggy bay mare. I remember Dad standing in the awakening barnyard, clapping softly to keep the blood in his fingers. We rode single file into the hills, heading for what Mr. Ford supposed from my description to be an old line cabin that had belonged to his ranch long before. It lay an indeterminate distance west in a valley fertile enough to offer some small pasture, yet remote enough that no cattle had grazed there in a generation. Also, the pasture had cracked open to lignite in the late 30s and caught fire, which had a bewildering effect on livestock. For all Mr. Ford knew, it was burning to this day. So I felt we were heading the right direction, though you may imagine what little comfort it gave me. Probably it won't surprise you that Swede took all this badly, that I'd kept Davy a secret from her. She judged the deepest kind of lie, that I'd revealed him didn't expunge the sin, but compounded it. I was both liar and traitor. I was an apostate. Before gaining forgiveness, I was to endure any number of historical comparisons, and not just with standard traitors like Judas and Brutus and Benedict Arnold. These were a fine start, but hardly enough for Swede, who remembered off the top of her head that it was little brother Raymond who'd betrayed the great bandito Joaquin Murrieta, whose bottled head still exists in a certain tavern in Texas. You could go in this very day and pay $1 to lift a dark curtain and see it. She knew of others, too. Any hopes I had of her rage being softened by my obvious misery proved groundless. She heard me, then went upstairs to fling a tantrum unequaled in her history. I heard papers flying, weeping mixed with various wordless growls, and the sound of a pillow being kicked with tremendous gusto. The last, I knew, was me. It was a longer ride than I remembered. We rode up into timbered breaks that felt familiar and along ridges of scrub pine and juniper, where it seemed I'd never been. Wind had so driven the snow that in places a laden horse could walk atop it, leaving only shallow tracks, but mostly they sank to their knees, shod hooves tossing up traces of sand or scoria or fine needled ferns. There was time to roll all manner of films in my head. Bad endings prevailed. In order of riding, I came second, after Mr. Ford and before Mr. Juval, the 3 deputies strung out behind. After a time, we descended a long, even slope where there was room for Mr. Juval to come abreast of me. He was on a bright palomino Mr. Ford had been loath to saddle. I believe, in fact, that Juval paid extra for the palomino, and indeed he looked good on the animal as they came alongside. We going the right way, then? He asked. I feared his attention. Miserably, I admitted to having no idea. He rode at my side a while without comment. He was older than Dad, wore a shirt-brimmed cowboy hat, and had a clipped white beard and a web of wrinkles under his eyes. He sat straight-backed on the palomino, floating easily above the horse as it slugged through the snow. I consider Martin Anderson a friend, he said after a time. I nodded. You don't know, I guess. No, sir. We were riding through a fairly open valley I might have recognized, but the wind had erased any tracks. We could have been the first people through in years. Well, he said, I suppose you feel like a Hall of Fame turncoat just now, taking us to your brother. Yes, sir, I do. Why did Mr. Juval want to talk about it? He knew how I felt. Arriving late, he'd stayed up much of the night talking to Dad. They'd called me down in the wee hours so Juval could ask me particulars. What weapons I'd seen in the cabin, what stocks of ammunition and food. At his request, I drew a layout of the place showing windows, door, stove, and chimney. He wondered whether I'd got a peek at Sarah's quarters. He said the more I could tell him, the better things would be for Davy. He said this 4 or 5 times. You wish you'd kept quiet? He asked. Davy's not the problem for your friend Anderson, I told him. It's Jape Walzer. So you mentioned. Last night Mr. Juval had seemed, if not entirely in our corner, at least leaning toward it. When I told him about Walzer, his crazy mind, his ambivalence about Anderson's proximity, even Walzer's own characterization of himself as a wolf to Davy's squirrel, Mr. Juval had listened with evident interest. He'd made notes on a yellow pad as though each detail confirmed this Walzer as a long-sought bad man it would be an honor to catch. He said, yes, yes. Now he seemed much less accommodating. Anxious for reassurance, I took an ingratiating tone. Mr. Juval, what's Jape Walzer wanted for? What did he do? The slope had leveled off, and his palomino was edging restlessly ahead. Juval reined back long enough to give me a look I'd never forgotten. Not a mean look, or disrespectful, the look perhaps of years spent in disappointment. He said, Son, you've got to remember something. Your brother killed 2 boys last year, then broke jail. This Robinson, Walzer, whatever his name is, I don't know him from Adam. He let the reins fall against the horse's neck and trotted up to talk to Lonnie Ford. We were getting close, riding now through country I knew for certain, yet we'd slowed. Lonnie Ford, leading, stopped to squint from time to time. The wind was getting teeth, lashing the horses' tails along their flanks and tilting Mr. Juval's cowboy hat over his eyes. Under this faltering progress, I had time to think it all over, to doubt what had appeared conclusive. The nearer we came to the cabin, the more likely it seemed that the enigmatic Robinson really wasn't Jape Walzer, that he was simply what Mr. Anderson had supposed, a fellow who'd given Davy a ride, then acquired cold feet about talking to a federal man. So what that Anderson hadn't found him in the phone book? Lots of people didn't have telephones. So what that Walzer was unconcerned when I arrived, all aflap about the putrid fed? It was senseless to give meaning to his reactions. The man talked about sea monsters. He steered by stars of his own invention. The idea emerged, seeming true the moment it wiggled free, that I'd betrayed my brother needlessly. That Anderson, while he'd gone out foolishly in a dangerous storm, was in no danger from any Robinson. I sat the bay mare, recognition of my blunder attached to my heart like a leech. Up ahead, Lonnie Ford, who'd been consulting with Mr. Juval in some serious matter, turned his horse and lopped back to me through the snow. Unlike the self-contained Mr. Ford of my constructions, he was a nervous man with clear misery in his face. He rode up so our 2 horses met shoulder to shoulder. They rubbed necks, but Lonnie didn't say anything to me, or even look at me. He kept gazing off to his left. Is something the matter, Mr. Ford? He nodded. I saw he was a man for whom words were a desperate problem. I felt bad for him, though it did give me a lift somehow. I leased the ranch, he said after another hard moment. I never saw this cabin before. I told Mr. Juval that. It took me a second to see where this placed us. Does any of this look right to you? Asked Lonnie Ford. He looked at me sideways. Anguished is not too strong a word, then nodded at the hills around us. Any of it? My first thought was that God in my disconsolate hour had slid open a hatch. Lonnie Ford didn't know where we were. The fellow guiding us to Davy was asking me for directions. Suppressing dizzy yelps, I took stock. We were on the west gradient of a gentle beveled hill, ringed above with twisted jack pine and scrub juniper and larger trees like cedars. Ahead, to the left, rose exhilarating cut-rock cliffs of sandstone and scoria and some school-brick-colored clay. I knew where we were, all right. Knew, moreover, if we bore to the left, behind the cliffs, we'd be steering away from Davy. Lonnie Ford said quietly, I told Mr. Juval. Behind us, the deputies, blown clean of jocularity, had begun to mutter. Up front, Juval sat the palomino, looking like a man set on winning by any means. Someday, you know, we're going to be shown the great ledger of our recorded decisions, a dread concept you nonetheless know in your deepest soul is true. "We have to bear left," I told Lonnie Ford. It was a slick climb in places, a steep one in others, and no one really wished to make it. According to my misdirection, Lonnie Ford trotted forward, and I saw him pointing and nodding with something like assurance. Jewel reached in a saddlebag and withdrew a large pair of binoculars and trained them on the slope of rock and snow-swept talus that would take us behind the cliffs. I remember he peered through those glasses for a long time, then put them down and turned and looked at me. A trenchant gaze I couldn't return. He swung about and up we went. We climbed strung out so a skidding horse wouldn't panic the others. Perhaps it didn't seem as bad an ascent to me as to the rest. No natural rider, I exercised no authority over the mare, whose footing was like a guarantee. At the bottom lay a repose of burst sandstone, as though a vast slab or reef had breached from the height of land and slid rupturing down. The route then narrowed to a generous U, higher on right than left, and occupied by a tribe of twisted dwarf evergreens. Only gradually did the incline become less manageable, narrowing first to a V, so it was like walking in the bow of a very small boat, then lifting before us until we leaned close over the horses' necks and felt gravity looking for a hold. Briefly, I feared for my deception that Mr. Juval would throw off the climb as impossible and turn us back on course. Perhaps he would have, had the way been wide enough for a horse to turn. Yet we gained the top. For a steep instant below the rim, the mare seemed to balance upright, my heels at her haunches, arms around her neck, face in her mane. Then she lurched and broke forward, coming out on level earth. There was the big, cold sky moving over us. Juval and Lonnie Ford had dismounted to wait, their animals blowing and shaking their heads. I confess to a certain exultation. My artifice had worked. The cabin lay somewhere to the right, in a valley. Our way now lay clearly to the left. We were on a mesa of sorts, where the wind had removed all snow except tan labor from which dead grasses poked. I slipped off the mare and stood beside her like the other men, while the deputies struggled over the crest one by one. There on the mesa we enjoyed a prevalent good humor, even if my reasons were unique. Sheriff Lance poured coffee in a thermos lid and passed it around. The deputy who'd followed me up, name of Fitger, came over and told me he was sorry to be hunting my brother. Lonnie Ford, and this ached, shook my hand. His eyes were so grateful they appeared damp, though this was probably an effect of the wind. Only Juval remained detached. While the rest of us stretched with relief, he swung back on the palomino and trotted to a small rise atop the cliffs. Profiled against sky, he looked like Robert E. Lee. He had his binoculars out. "Ford," he called. The rancher was sipping coffee. He sighed, handed it off, and heaved aboard. He came alongside Juval, who passed him the glasses. Adjusting them to his eyes, he looked over the valley. The wind snaked across the mesa. I'd been warm from the climb, but no more. The grasses hissed like wire. Ford dismounted, sat down cross-legged. Elbows on knees, he leaned into the binoculars. Next thing, the two of them were trotting back to us, Juval looking official and stormy, and Ford unreadable. Juval coughed and spat. "It's back down, then, gentlemen," said he, and with barely a pause, rode to the rim we'd all been so pleased to master and dropped over. Nobody spoke. We were listening to the palomino's hooves sliding on rock and dirt. I felt people looking at me, but perhaps no one was. I know Lonnie Ford wasn't, for later he didn't look at me even when I wished he would, or ever again, so far as I know. In a few words he told the men we'd come the wrong way. Mr. Juval had discerned the cabin laying down the valley. You might expect some outburst from men so informed, but there was none. I felt instead a hush. To say I felt like a caught sneak doesn't touch it. I was a boy caught deceiving honest men. I went over next to the last, just a single deputy behind. If you've never essayed a decline like that on the back of a horse, I don't know what to tell you. There's a separation from ground and a hopeless union with the animal as you go down. Can't hear a thing but gravel clatter. Absolutely can't steer. The mare laid her ears back, splayed her front feet, set haunches to earth, and slid. Far below I could see Juval and the sheriff standing beside their mounts. Lonnie Ford was in front of me by some yards. His horse, a big-barreled Roman-nosed quarter, began to skid sideways. I saw it happen. Hind quarters bearing right, hooves scrabbling, the horse seeking balance. Then its wayward back legs struck a boulder and the horse went down. Mr. Ford was a man of size, but he just disappeared. The horse slid forward on its side, neck up, trying to rise. You'd have thought it would slow. It flipped once, hooves every place, then hit a steep drop and flipped again. All this time I was skidding along behind the mare. At last the gradient eased and the down horse stopped. It lay in the path at an alien angle. my mare clattered to a halt beside it, the last deputy arriving behind me in a spray of broken stone. "Where's Ford?" the deputy said, swinging down. We couldn't see him. The way that horse had slid, it wouldn't have surprised me to have to gather Ford up a limb at a time. We did locate one spurred boot sticking out from under the horse. There was nothing in the boot but a sock. The horse was in awful shape. After that second flip, it couldn't raise its head and lay trembling on the rubble. The others had joined us in mute shock except for Jovel, who passed us at an angry trot, ordering, "Don't you shoot that animal!" He headed back up the hill and stopped beside a ragged, dirty clot, mostly hidden by a dwarf pine. He didn't immediately get off the horse, but gazed down at the clot like you would at something loathsome. That Lonnie Ford lived at all commends the resilient design of humans, the rib cage in particular. Ford's rib cage, and it was a big one, was rolled over not once, but twice by an entire American quarter horse, yet his organs remained whole. The rest of Ford was worse off. His arm lay twisted behind in such a way Sheriff Lands diagnosed a broken collarbone. Over one shoulder a hole had been rubbed through jacket, shirt, and skin. He was down to muscle. His face, on the same side, was swelling purple as we watched. The only place on him that looked okay was his bare right foot. He was unconscious, which relieved us all. The sheriff had done stints as an ambulance man and had a kit in his saddlebag. He worked on Ford right where he lay, checking his ribs, pacing up the shoulder, easing the arm out to the side. When with Juval's help, he realigned the collarbone, Ford woke a moment to thrash, then sank as though clubbed. The sheriff directed a jury-rigged stretcher of poles and tied coats. While they moved forward to even ground, Juval put a hand on my neck and steered me to a place some yards from the others. He asked, "Did you misdirect me on purpose?" When I didn't answer immediately, Juval said, "Son?" His tone implied, if not gentleness, at least understanding. "Yes, I did, sir." Juval cuffed the right side of my head so hard I spun to my knees. Next thing, he gripped one shoulder and set me back on my feet, saying, "Listen to me now." It was difficult, as a high tone occupied my right ear, but Juval earnestly told me 5 or 6 specific things he found discouraging about my character. If you don't mind, I'd rather not restate them, but they were by and large true, and seeing no advantage in disputing the more capacious charges, I agreed with them. All, as the broken must. Concluding, he said, "You're pretending, aren't you, to have remorse?" If not for the belt in the ear, I'd have quickly reassured him my misery was authentic, but as I said, I wasn't hearing well. I thought he was asking did I feel bad about the horse. "Yes, sir," I said. He cuffed me again, same ear, and I walked back to the men while I knelt in the snow. They made Lonnie Ford as snug as possible, carrying him into a short thicket and laying him on a bed of gathered juniper. Though unconscious, the rancher had begun to twitch and mutter. When Juval was satisfied Ford wouldn't freeze solid, he gathered the others, who checked cinches and spoke unhappily among themselves as they climbed aboard. Only now did I see they were leaving with Ford and going on to hunt Davy without me. "Did you think we'd have you along all the way?" Juval asked. "We'd have stationed you back with the deputy anyway. Now you'll just have to keep an eye on Ford." The Palomino wheeled about. Luckily, I was muzzy from being hit. More lucid, I might have wept for grief and outrage. As it was all I thought to do was yell, "What should I do if he wakes up?" "Tell him a story," Juval called, his voice already reduced against the Badlands. Looking back, though, it was better to be stuck with poor Lonnie Ford than be babysat by a deputy. It gave me work. It kept my mind from the aches in head and soul. Every time despair came courting, Mr. Ford would moan and thrash. I held his limbs when he dreamed and rebunched his juniper pillow. After a bit, he started to shiver. His whole body seemed to contract and stiffen. It was spooky, a skeleton dance, and I wondered what it would be like if Mr. Ford died and I had to stay. Who knew how long beside his body? What if it got dark? What we wanted was a fire, which sent me back to the horse. I'd forgotten about him, the poor, downed animal lying a few yards away. He was alive, though resigned, the sight of his belly raising and falling, nothing else moving but his eyes. I opened the accessible saddlebag, for he was lying upon the other, and took out a can of all-purpose oil, a heavy black pouch containing harness and leather punch, and other tools more foreign. Also a book called Old American Houses, with a stained blue dust jacket. At bottom lay a small concave bottle of whiskey, wrapped against concussion in a chambray shirt. For a whiskey or against whiskey, you had to admire that bottle. Battered down a hillside, bounced on by a horse, with its swaddling peeled away, it lay like an amber ornament in my hand. The red paper seal was unbroken. The horse sighed heavily. An animal that size gives off so much heat I'd snuggled against its belly. It seemed to like the company, and since Lonnie Ford wasn't making any noise, I stayed a while. I knew the horse should have been shot after the fall. The only reason he wasn't was our nearness to Davy's cabin. Juval wanted to preserve surprise. I tried to brace up, to think of anything beside the likelihood of gunshots from the hills. We were awfully close, within a mile certainly, and the men had already been gone some time. Half an hour? How long could it take? I imagined Juval quietly issuing his orders, the men spreading out, staying low. Swede had told me how the James gang were ambushed in a farmhouse in exactly this way. My decision to tell Dad everything now lay revealed as foolishness. Swede was right. I was among the disgusting double-crossers of history. I was one of the crumbs. Cole Younger, you will recall, came out of that farmhouse with 11 gunshot wounds. I didn't think Davy could survive even 11 gunshot wounds. I hoped he'd come out with his hands up when offered the chance. I hoped Mr. Juval would give him the chance. I had doubts, despite his promise to Dad. I doubted lawmen in general. Cole Younger was sitting in his kitchen chair, Swede said, reading a newspaper, when so many rifles started popping the house shredded like paper mache. Among his other wounds were porcelain shards in arm and face. A cup of coffee got shot right out of his hand. Then I wondered what Davy would think, should he surrender, to see me there with Juval and the rest. Somehow this hadn't entered my thinking till now, but it made up for lost time. In this picture I saw no forgiveness for myself. Not from Davy, not from Swede, not from anyone but Dad, who was so forgiving it almost didn't count. It seemed necessary just then to touch base with the Lord. Shutting my eyes, I leaned into the horse. I prayed in words for a little while, for Davy, of course, and for Mr. Ford, whom I could hear making chewing sounds in his sleep, and for my own future, which seemed a boarded-up window, and that language went away, and I prayed in a soft, high-pitched lament any human listener would have termed a whine. We serve a patient God. In the midst of this came the conviction I hadn't prayed for, Martin Anderson, nor thought of him since we set out, nor Jabe Walzer, nor Sarah, who were sharing in every way Davy's hazardous mourning. I'm afraid I discharged this duty quickly regarding Walzer. Later, I would wish I'd spent more on him particularly. Anderson, whom I despised, now appeared on my mind as he might have to a worried brother. Talk about an unwelcome change. There in the cold, curled against Mr. Ford's sighing horses, I repented of hatred in general, and especially that cultivated against the putrid fed. A pain started up as of live coals inside, and like that I knew where he was, knew with certainty why he hadn't come back out of the blizzard. I began to weep, not only for Anderson. Weeping seems to accompany repentance. Weeping seems to accompany repentance most times. No wonder. Could you reach deep in yourself to locate that organ containing delusions about your general size in the world? Could you lay hold of this and dredge it from your chest and look it over in daylight? Well, it's no wonder people would rather not. Tears seem small enough. Thus I cried some, then remembered I still had to pray for Sarah. It's mysterious how comfort arrives, for this too should have been full of torment, given her imminent peril. Yet thinking of her calmed my shaken spirit. I imagined her walking with friends in a sunlit park in a small town, laughing around a supper she had not cooked. I thought of her pleasure in knowing someone like Swede, for whom all the world was an epic poem, delivered from Walter and his conjugal ambitions. Who knew what goodness lay in store? "Otter!" cried Lonnie Ford in an arid voice. I scrambled to him. He was twisting around, mashing down the junipers. When he saw me, he relaxed, panting, and looked away. "Aunt Otter," he said. His lips were parted and thick. Between them, his tongue lay dry as a toad. "Just a second." I ran back to the horse and returned with the whiskey. He didn't like the taste much, and it probably stung, but it restored his enunciation. "Bust it up," he observed. "Yes, sir." "Where'd they all go?" "After my brother," I replied. He shut his eyes at this, in resentment or resignation. He shut his mouth too and tried breathing through his nose, but it was blocked and made only the merest squeal. "How long ago?" "An hour, maybe." "Give me more of that." He couldn't use his hands. I had to pour the whiskey in his mouth by catfuls. "Where's Billy?" he asked at length. "His horse." "A little ways that way. He can't lift up his head, Mr. Ford. They didn't shoot him." "No, sir." He lay thinking about this. Those buggers. We sat in silence a long time. Remembering Juval's advice, I asked Mr. Ford if he'd like a story. He'd gone sullen and wouldn't answer. It was hard to blame him. In the end, I retrieved the book from his saddlebag old American houses and read aloud from a chapter describing the ruinous attempts of modern citizens to update architecture before better left intact. In building for themselves, the book said, many a 19th century workman had indeed built well enough for the ages. It was a pretty good book, I suspect, making the case for honor, but I didn't get to read much, for soon Juval and the rest came trotting back in the blackest of moods. They'd come to the cabin, which lay open and empty with snow drifted in. They'd found no sign of any person save Anderson, whose felt fedora sat in rumpled condition on the cold stove. In silence, Juval presided over the further binding of Lonnie Ford and the construction of a travois by which he could be carried home. Then we all mounted, Juval last. He shot the horse Billy through the head, and we got away from there.